Good morning and welcome to Riding the Podcast Wave, Laws, Flaws and Helpful Clauses. We'll be discussing a lot of very good topics this morning. I hope to be very helpful for you, including the current landscape in the MENA region, where to begin, red flags in content, protecting your IP, revenue streams and ownership and licensing. I'm Charlotte Sutcliffe, an associate at Altamimi in the Technology, Media and Telecommunications team. I'm joined by Fiona Robertson, who will introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar names in our list of attendees. And welcome, everybody, today. It's nice to see you. I'm sitting here in the Dubai office. Charlotte and I are actually social distancing by about 13,000 kilometres. She's working from Brisbane today, down in Australia. Those of you that don't know me, I'm the head of media at Altamimi. I work in the telecommunications media technology, media and telecommunications team. We look after all sorts of things relating to content, and at the moment we're seeing a wave of interest in podcasting from our clients and from new clients in particular. So that's why we thought we would start today and talk about podcasting. Charlotte's going to introduce some things. I'm not sure how many people we've got on, but I think we should just get in, Charlotte, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so there is a questions function. If anyone would like to ask any questions, we will either answer them as we go or at the end. So if you just go to the questions function, you can just put in whatever you want or comments. Let me know where you're from, why you're interested in the podcast, something that will allow us to direct our content a little bit more easily. So the first question here is, what is the state of podcasting in the UAE and MENA region generally? Well, I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that podcasting is a wonderful thing. It's becoming more and more mainstream, and given the great COVID-19 experience that we had, it's become even more popular. Some of the reasons for that is because it is free, usually to listen to, and very cheap or even free to produce sometimes. All you really need is a microphone and a laptop. And you can listen anywhere, walking the dog, at the gym. Even some people are lucky enough to listen at work. I won't tell anyone about that. In the UAE, generally, it is becoming increasingly popular. So we have around 1.3 million regular podcast listeners, with 16% of the adult population tuning in weekly to listen to podcasts. Apart from that, we have some Arabic and MENA region podcasting specialists, including Duncan, Rising Giants, Finyal Media, who are becoming more and more prominent in the podcasting scene. One challenge that we've seen, even though podcasting has grown exponentially in the last 12 months, is a need for more strong kind of Arabic and MENA region content. People are very happy to tune into Apple Podcasts and listen to podcasts produced elsewhere, but there is some misconception that the quality is not going to be as good. So there's definitely a need to create more Arabic content. And living in the UAE, you know that there's a huge range of different people with different interests, sometimes very niche interests in specific topics. So really, it's a never-ending choice of things to discuss on podcasting. So there's definitely a wonderful opportunity there to have some more locally produced content that's relevant for everyone here. The second question that we have is, what are the first steps that podcasters need to know to put their podcast on air? To start a podcast, you need a strong idea, and you need to develop your concept, a topic, a name, a format, and a target length. Perhaps it's even necessary to do a bit of market research, find out who your audience is, whether they're prevalent, and whether that podcast has already been done 1,000 times. The second step is potentially to design your artwork and your branding, maybe look at what your podcast is going to be called, whether you need to register that podcast name, possibly as a trademark. And then you record and edit your files, your audio files, such as MP3s. A microphone is obviously recommended, and you could possibly even get some more high-tech podcasting equipment later down the track. You need a place to host your files. There are some free hosting services available online, but often the issue there is they'd like to put their adverts and sponsorships over your podcasting, which might not be relevant to your podcasting content and may detract from the wonderful content that you're producing. So just be a bit wary of that. Then you need to distribute it, and you can go through Apple or Spotify or any of the local streaming services as well. I'll now hand over to Fiona for a couple of questions.
So what we're seeing in the region at the moment is obviously the early stages of development of a podcasting industry, and we're seeing the usual scramble for revenue. So we wanted to just address the revenue issue first up, because what we're seeing is that the way that the revenue model is driving the podcast is actually then making us understand how the contracts are going to flow after that happens. So what we're seeing largely is client-driven podcasting. So we're seeing a lot of brands that are interested in entering the podcast space and doing that content-driven marketing that we've seen brands like Red Bull, for example, really lead on over the past decade. And so we're seeing clients do that. We're also seeing clients do it not just as our main event. So, for example, we might be putting on a festival or some sort of music event, and we're seeing clients requesting as part of their sponsorship or as part of the brand content that they want to get some podcast content out of this as well, so they can use it and brand it and get it out to the rest of the world. Sponsorships in and of themselves, we're not seeing a lot of that yet, but I'm seeing interest in it. I'm getting questions about it, like how do we do a contract for a brand that wants us to create podcasting? Who's going to own it? Who's going to control it? And we're going to address all of those issues today, because obviously that becomes really important. The other thing at the moment, what we're seeing mainly is we're seeing podcast networks being set up, as Charlotte's already described. It's Finyal Media, and we've got Ducan Media, and we've got the new guys, Rising Giants, who started this week. They're obviously running one network, and all of the advertising is going through them, and they're creating the revenue that way. Membership and subscription, wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be nice? Well, at the moment, I don't think the world is ready for subscription-based podcasting. We're not seeing much of it in this region. We're not really seeing much of it globally, to be honest. But I think, as we did with OTT video content back in the early days of Netflix, when we all said we wouldn't pay for it, and now we all pay for at least 4 of them, or at least I do, that I'm sure will come in time. And obviously that will, as it does evolve into subscription, that will change the licensing model from the talent. And finally, licensing, of course, is where we would like, I'm sure the talent would like to see people paying to use their content. And again, I think that's something that we'll see further down the track. Each of these models will have contract specifics. So we're going to have to keep that in mind as we work through the contract chain today. One of the things I think we have to look at is the key relationship that is set up between a podcast network and the talent that's going to be sitting on the podcast network. No podcasts can survive without the talent. So what we've got coming in is how do you deal with the talent, how do you contract the talent, and who owns what in relation to the two parties. We need the talent in order to drive the traffic. And I know I can see that Izzy has just pointed up that most podcasts do use guest speakers. You're absolutely correct. What we're seeing is there's a central host. Now the host is fully and absolutely conversant with everything that's going on, but as Izzy has said, then you've got the guest speakers that come in, and we'll be talking about how we deal with those contractually in a moment. The first thing we need to do is work out how we're going to work with the host, the person who's going to feature as the name and face of our podcast. And you're going to address that in the same way as you would with any key talent for any other media. You need to work out who owns what. If you're a broadcaster getting talent to come in to do a show, this is not going to be a question. The broadcaster is always going to own the programming, unless it's under a license agreement. With podcasting, what we're seeing is the podcast network is trying to own as much of the content as possible. And that, I think, at this stage of the relationship is probably appropriate. You're going to have discussions about who's paying for what, and I think the who's paying for what is then going to guide the ownership. So the podcasting network may provide studio, may provide editing of script, may provide all of the technology and all of the back end in order to get the content out. If that's the case, they quite rightly have a position to ask for ownership of the content. If they can't get that, then I think what brands and podcast networks are looking for is the ability to have an exclusive window to use the content before the talent themselves can take it elsewhere. And again, that's only a reasonable thing to ask for. We have to be sure you're going to get the usual publicity rights. This is where we're seeing a lot of podcast contracts falling down at the moment, is they're not getting the publicity rights from the talent and from the host that they're using as key talent. This is really, really important, and it's a bit of a rookie error, but you need these people to drive people to the podcast network itself. And without getting those publicity rights, you can't put their face on anything without them possibly asking you for money. We certainly don't want that. Now, content standards, we're going to address those right at the end in some detail, but it's really important that contractually you make sure they comply with standards. And conversant to that point, you have to be able to have a takedown right. This is really, really important for talent. We've seen a lot of this in the influencer space, and a lot of the issues we had in early influencer space, we're going to start seeing again now with podcasting talent. Again, because a lot of them are not used to being public faces, and a lot of them are not used to dealing with the content regulations. If something goes wrong with a podcast, you're going to have to take it down in order to mitigate damage for you as a podcast network and for the talent as well. It's got to come down. Make sure that's a contractual right, because what you don't want is people arguing about whether or not it should come down later on. As the podcast network, you hold primary liability, you've got to be able to take it down. One other thing that we've been seeing over the last few months, particularly during lockdown, is that brands and sponsors are wanting to see audiovisual content that's created out of the podcast itself. This obviously creates different problems, because all of a sudden now you've got filming rights and you've got approval on the final version. It's not so they can show the entire thing as an audiovisual, so they can use excerpts for promotion. But if that's needed, again, it needs to be within the contract. The questions we've got, we're gonna try and integrate them into content. Wish us luck with that. So we'll answer those as we move on. Charlotte's going to have a little chat about third-party content now, and what you need to do if you're going to be integrating other images and music into the podcast.
Thanks, Fiona. So who creates the content in a podcast? Now, unless you are exceptionally talented and you have the time to develop all the content in a podcast, from the concept itself, the script writing, the audio files, intros, outros, the artwork itself, you'll probably have to engage third parties to do that. It's very unlikely you'll be able to do everything. And so there might be a myriad of stakeholders involved in this, from script writers to composers, lyricists, etc., etc. And so the position in the Copyright Act is that the author of the work will own that work. That sounds pretty straightforward, as you all know, but there are some strange things that happen when there's an employer working with an employee, or you contract someone to do something for you, or where there's joint authors. So really, when there's three norms of ownership for podcasting. The podcast network creates it and then owns it. The podcast network creates it and has an exclusive window to use it, followed by a non-exclusive use. Or the creator, being the talent, so the script writer or the audio, the songwriter or whatever, owns it and merely allows a podcast network or other third party to use it. So either way, the reality is the best thing you can do is have written agreements that either assign all of the IP over to who should own it, which really should be the podcast network, just one party at the top that owns everything or has broad rights to use that. The rule of thumb really is, if it's created specifically for the podcast network, possibly you should have a broad license or an assignment, or if it's just a separate piece of IP, like a song, I mean, you're not going to ask Rihanna to assign the rights over to a podcast, so you're going to need a license to use that. So Fiona will go into a little bit more of the exceptions to that and answer a few more questions.
Yeah, one of the questions we get asked quite a bit is when you're getting down to using third-party content, what about if you're using a small excerpt of a news or maybe a little piece of music in order to comment on it? So particularly, there's a lot of podcasts that talk about current events and news, and they might want to do a little bit of an excerpt from a CNN program or from Arabia in order to discuss that news event. Generally speaking, we don't have copyright protection for news events. However, reporting of news does itself have a copyright attached to it, only because there's a creative element involved in the reporting. So there's the reporter and there's, you know, the words that they've used, the script that they've put together. However, on a risk analysis, you have to look at that and say, would anybody genuinely come after me for using a very small excerpt of news so that I can then go on and discuss that event? And I think on a case-by-case basis, you need to think about what that risk genuinely is. Most news broadcasters don't have a huge issue with you using that sort of content. Other content, however, you do have to be careful. And I'm going to put the big red flag up about music, like I always do, because music content is particularly contentious. And we are starting to see in the UAE markets an uptake in people trying to claim music rights and stop people from music content without licensing, which, you know, is absolutely as it should be. If you are a music creator, and I think we might have a couple of representatives on today from the music producers, you want to get money for your music. It's only right and fair that you be compensated for the creativity that you put into the music. So if you are going to be using somebody else's music as your intro, outro, as your tag, as your whatever, or even holus bolus within your content, strongly suggest that you get a license to do so. You've probably seen early podcasting was the Desert Island Discs that came out of the UK, where they do the 10 songs, and what they were doing, instead of playing the music, which they couldn't afford to license, they did about the first sort of 8 to 10 bars of each track, and then they would cut it. Strongly recommend you follow that model if you don't want to do licensing, because music is, as I say, we are seeing a lot more requests for us to investigate third-party use of music without licensing in region. So the old days of use and pray are no longer applicable. In relation to other third-party content, Charlotte's going to do a quick buzz through on using other people's things, and then I think we should talk about protecting your own podcast for a bit as well. Charlotte, do you want to take that away?
Yeah, so in terms of other content, what we have usually in a podcast to protect is copyright, trademarks, and publicity rights. Now, publicity rights, you should get a release, making sure that you have a license to the likeness and the appearance and the voice of the person that's you've brought on to endorse your podcast. Maybe it's a celebrity or a high profile person, and make sure that you can exploit that. For trademarks, you have to register that. But copyright, as I've said, it's owned by the author. As long as it's in material form and it's an expression of idea, you have automatic protection. But if you're using other people's third-party IP, like I said, you really have to make sure that we have a written instrument that details who owns the intellectual property. Now, there are a few exceptions to that. For instance, if you've got copyright-free work. So if you find a song online that's copyright-free, good for you, and it works with your podcast and it's high quality, that's wonderful. Or artwork as well. There are a few things online, Creative Market, Dribble, which will allow you to pay a small fee to use and exploit the artwork or the song. You just have to make sure that the terms of that license will allow you to actually exploit it for commercial gain rather than just for your own personal use. Otherwise, it's fine and it will save you a lot of money and hassle and possibly negotiations going forward. There are a few exceptions generally to using copyright as well. That is fair use and works in the public domain. So if you're only using a minuscule amount, like Fiona said, possibly okay, but again, it's really on a case-by-case basis. Or if it works in the public domain, which you'll know about as well. So Fiona will go into more of the details about fair use and fair dealing, because they are very specific areas.
One thing I do want to talk about before I move into that is the who decides issue when it comes to these matters, because obviously what we've got is quite a complex environment where we've got certain rights, we've got the copyrights, we've got the trademarks, we've got the publicity rights, and then sitting underneath that, then we've got the content standards, which we're just about to dive into. Who makes these decisions in relation to the works? And I think it's really important that the copyrights that the person who's actually holding the podcast rights, and that will probably be the podcast network, keeps and controls those rights. Because the who decides thing, like who decides if I'm going to include a snippet of news, who decides if this music is properly cleared, who decides if I can include references to health warnings, and someone has asked about health warnings, and I'm going to touch on that right now. There are certain areas in content that you have to be really careful of in the UAE. We're going to, for example, talk about healthcare, because healthcare is a current red button for the UAE government. So if you're giving healthcare advice or you're offering healthcare products without a proper license, you can expect the regulators to come and knock on your door. How do you control that? I have a question here about the difference between getting regulatory permissions to advise the public about medical thing. For me, the obligation for getting that would probably be most likely to be done by that podcast network, because they're going to have the proper trade licenses to be able to get the approvals that are needed to carry the medical advertising. And you would work hand in hand with the medical supplier on that if that's what you're choosing to do. So podcasts about medical advice and medical regulatory, really, really tricky area in this part of the world. And I do suggest, if you're thinking about going down that rabbit hole, you do get some legal advice from someone who understands the very thick folder I have about healthcare advertising in this part of the world, because it's a really tricky area. And as a podcast network, you need to be aware that you can be held liable for carrying that without permissions. So make sure you get that under control. So the who decides thing is really important. I think creators are always very keen to keep control over their content, and then we get back again to this negotiation between the two parties, which is, you know, who has the right to determine what the content looks like. When you're getting into negotiations with talent, and talent of course form the very, very backbone of everything that we're talking about here. Podcasts without talent simply don't work. But to tell talent that they're not able to have final approval over things can sometimes be a difficult discussion to have. If you're doing a brand-focused piece of work, if it's for a client of yours that is a brand, then there is no question that the brand is going to want to have those final approvals. So again, when it comes down to who is going to take permissions to get regulatory approval for healthcare advice, the brand is going to want to know that that's all been signed, sealed, and delivered, because the PR fallout for getting that wrong is simply not going to be acceptable to them. Where do we want to go from here, Charlotte? Should we go into the content standards? We've had a couple of questions about that. We've had a question about public performance. Thank you, Jennifer. I'll thank you in person for that later. Public performance is obviously a really tricky area here. If anyone is familiar with the complexities of music law, you may be aware that public performance is payable by anyone who is literally publicly performing music, and a podcast is considered to be a public performance. The complexities of clearing public performance rights are different from Western catalogue than they are to Arabic catalogue, and the whole thing is made much more complex by the fact that the Middle East doesn't yet have any collective management organisations who are able to license and collect revenue for public performance. So yes, podcast operators should be paying public performance royalties. Whether or not they're able to in this part of the world is a different question, and we probably need to do a fairly complex drill down on how that would look for your particular podcast, depending on what sort of music you're using and how you're using it, and also, weirdly, the technology of where it's coming and what country it's coming from might also add. I'm not going to go into it. I will honestly send you all to sleep if I start going into the depths of music law, and I'll talk myself around in circles. So let's not go there. But thank you, Jennifer. You completely owe me a coffee for asking that question. Now we have, Izzy has asked a question about guest speakers and managing the risk with guest speakers in relation to content. So we're going to talk about content now, and we have left a fair amount of time for content because we find that this region is an area, this is an area that everybody wants to talk about. There's a couple of things I think we should probably start with. Firstly, before we get too involved in the complexities of the law, there are 9 different laws that you need to know about in relation to content in the UAE only. And going across the Middle East, there's probably a similar number in each GCC country. So you've got your general press laws, then you've got your standards, you have your penal code, which is where your defamation laws and your political commentary laws come from. You also have the telecommunications law that allow the TRA as the regulator to block your podcast if it's doing something that it shouldn't be doing. And that's a really, really important law to know, because that is where you're going to you'll lose your signal. And when they block, they may block the podcast They may block the whole page, depending on where the complaint comes from and what it looks like. And then there are various regulations that have been passed by the National Media Council. The big one, though, the one that everybody hates, is the cybercrimes law, and that's the one where there is criminal liability that can arise to the authors and the publishers, which is the podcast networks, in relation to the content. Now, I'd like to think that nobody that's on here today is going to be diving into the stuff that's going to be breaching the cybercrimes law, because we really are talking about big red flags. We are talking about pornography. We are talking about criticism of the Arab state. We're talking about criticism of Islam as a religion. We're talking about the sins of gambling. Obviously, that is a prohibition under the cybercrimes law. So these are the sorts of big red flags that we're not expecting content here to be dealing with. If you are contracting guests, however, that are not familiar with the Middle East, we do suggest that you include it either within the contract or include it as a little handout that you give to them before they go and record their content. Many years ago, I was a lawyer for a big international film that was coming in, and a lot of the Hollywood people were not very accustomed and were a little bit scared about what they were going to be dealing with when they got to the Middle East. So we did a little one-page red flag, don't do thing, and that was extremely helpful. And I think developing something like that you give to all of your guests, it's slightly less confronting than putting it within the contract and breaking it all down, but you can still refer to it in the contract as something that they're going to have to comply with, and it makes it feel a little bit more touchy-feely and a little bit nicer for your talent, who obviously don't want to be scared into over-censoring themselves, because that is the other issue we see here, is that people think everything cannot be talked about at all, and then they don't say anything at all. So just going into the content laws generally, just checking we haven't got any other questions on content. No, we're good so far. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. We love getting them. There are, as I said, quite a lot of content laws. The big one is the 1980 press law. Yes, 1980. So you can imagine how weird that is going to apply to a 2020 podcasting regime. It's 40 years out of date. However, it still has all the underlying concepts that are not permissible in content laws here. In 2017, then the government passed a content resolution, and that clarified all of the stuff that's in the PPL, in the press law, and gave it a lot more body. Now, if anybody wants to have a look at Article 5, which is the relevant article, I'm happy to send it to you. Just drop me an email afterwards, and you can see, because it really does put a lot of meat on the bones, if you like, of the stuff that's sitting in the press law. Getting your talent to comply with something that runs to about 5 or 6 pages of written text is unpleasant. And again, I would recommend some sort of one-page summary, dot points, make it nice and easy, and really only look at the stuff that is going to cause a takedown for you as a podcast network. So, you know, although Article 5 of the 2017 resolution it talks about no witchcraft and sorcery, and no references to things like horoscopes. It's probably not something you're really going to be concerned about, because that's not a big red letter for the government right now. They're much more concerned, as I said, about breaching healthcare regulations and doing things that are, at the moment, fake news. Big thing for the government right now is anything that is fake news, particularly in relation to the COVID regulations. So they are monitoring that sort of stuff. It's really important to know that all of these advertising regulations, these content regulations apply equally to content and advertising. So we don't necessarily have any differentiation between the two. Content is considered to be content across the board. So that means that not only does your host and their guests have to deal with the content resolutions, but also the brands have to be aware of that as well, because this, for them, if you're getting brand sponsored podcasting, it becomes an ad, and therefore it needs to be compliant as content from that perspective as well. If you're going to be talking about advertising, and it is a brand driven piece of podcasting, you have to be careful about all of the things about making sure that as a consumer facing brand message, it is true, and it's not misleading, and it's not going to, you know, make the person take the brand and buy the product without having all the knowledge as to whether or not this is a good product or it's a product that is suitable for use. So those consumer laws are going to come into play as well. So do be careful about those. Generally speaking, brands are already extremely aware of that, and particularly the global brands, very, very aware of that, because obviously they are dealing with these kind of regulations across other jurisdictions as well. Now I want to talk about defamation very, very quickly. Defamation is something that can be a little bit touchy-feely, a little bit subjective at times, because often you have somebody claiming that they have been defamed by material that to a third party may not feel as if it's really, you know, all that bad or all that defamatory in nature. In the UAE, defamation is a criminal action. It's criminal under the penal code and it's criminal under the cybercrime. So you've got two different laws that can be applied to defamatory conduct. Because of that, the person who gets to determine whether or not the material is defamatory is in fact the police prosecutor and not you or the person who is claiming the defamation. So it sits in their hands completely, and once it's gone into their hands, the person who's complaining pretty much loses track of it from there, and it goes into the police prosecution system. That does mean that yes, we're talking about penalties of fines, potentially we're talking about jail, and for those of us that are not nationals of the UAE, we're also talking about potential deportation, because the UAE cybercrimes law does allow for deportation if you're found to be infringing, which is exactly where you don't want to be. The other thing that's been problematic under the cybercrimes law has been the privacy laws. Now, I don't see this being an issue within podcasting, but it is something to just keep a side eye on to make sure that you're not doing anything that is infringing the privacy of a third party. I think I've talked way too much about content, and I would love to hear some questions if anybody has any about how this all is in play. I'm not seeing any questions about content though, and I don't want to dribble on about the content regulations, because I do think that one of the things we find in this particular part of the world is, as I've said before, oh, we have some more questions. Yeah, I've just found them. We do have a tendency as consumers to over-censor ourselves, and I think that we do have to think about that. Now, Fadi has asked a question, and it's long. Thank you, Fadi. It's lovely to see you. Are the UAE court's position on what constitutes an employment contract still the same? And if so, how does that impact future copyright assignment? Fadi, thank you for that question. Yes, look, under the UAE copyright law, there is a restriction on assignments of future copyright, and this does affect employment contracts and also contracts for supply of services where you are creating multiple pieces of work. We don't have a lot of clarity about what a piece of work is going to be considered as. So you may be creating one podcast, and therefore you would consider that you're only creating one piece of work, and the UAE copyright law allows you to create 5 and assign 5 future works. However, what if you've also done a script? What if you've done a redraft of the script? What if you did the podcast and then did a re-edit? What if across all of those components you get to the 6th one, and the 6th one is the final podcast works? And that's why the copyright wording that you use within your contracts has to be really, really clear on 2 points. Number 1, if there is a failure of the assignment, you need to have a backup, irrevocable and exclusive license. Really, really important. And number 2, if it fails, you have to have the right to request future documentation be signed, and that will obviously be signed after the creation of the podcast. You may also want to do it perhaps as part of your receipt process. If someone is signing off on approval, for example, you might get them to sign off on the copyright of the past works that they just created and finished that day. Hope that helps, Buddy. No, the position has not changed. We are still struggling with the assignment of future works. Are there risks to podcasters in the region who interview LGBTQ guests out of region who talk about those rights? Thank you, Izzy, for your question. what we do see in the region is a higher tolerance to content that is created outside of the region that talks about or is addressing issues that are controversial. So, for example, I have seen some extremely racy content now being shown on OSN as standard, without any editing at all, but it's not local content. It's content that's coming generally from the US, UK, Europe, and they're keeping all of the more difficult issues in. When it comes to LGBTQ, that's what we're seeing as well. And I think it's really important to address the fact that when you're discussing issues such as LGBTQ, you have to be careful that the content doesn't do two things. One is encourage the act of homosexuality or infer that someone in region is involved in that, which could cause problems to them. And the second thing is making sure that you don't accidentally veer into criticism of government and the government policies in relation to this, because that, of course, is an area of law where there is much less flexibility. So I wouldn't have too many issues with these interviews per se, but I would be very careful about the implications that might come out of that content. Claudius wants to know if you need a license to start podcasting. Hi, Claudius, nice to see you. I know so many of you, it's so nice. The short answer would be yes. In my view, it is a commercial activity. On that basis, it should be covered by your trade license. If your trade license includes broadcasting generally, it'll probably be covered. I would want to have another look at the 2018 e-media regulations to see how they're dealing with online and social media content and the licenses that they require for people who are doing things that are considered to be in the news and classified advertising space. So at this point, I'm not really sure that they're considering podcasting to be part of that, but I would probably want to have a chat to the National Media Council to see how that's going to pan out. And given that the Media Council only yesterday got rolled into the Department of the Ministry of Culture, we may be seeing some new movement and some new policies coming out of there over the next few months. Watch this space. But yes, I think I know that Claudius works at Spotify, and I'm quite sure that their trade license already covers them bringing content into the region and commercializing that through sponsorship. So I'm sure that your trade license would already cover podcasting. If you're just a brand, for example, that is involved in the event space, then your trade license is not going to permit you to create and broadcast podcasts. So you will probably have to look at doing an alteration to your trade license. Lovely. I think we've covered all the questions. If anyone would like clarification on questions, because I haven't addressed them properly, please let me know, because obviously it's really hard to get an engagement with you guys through just a question and answer format. Charlotte, would you like to do a little bit of a summary on where we are right now? And
yes, of course. And also, if anyone has any questions after the podcast, after our webinar, please email them through and we'll get back to you and send any links or anything like that. So we just want to sum up with kind of when it all goes wrong, what do you do, and when to see a lawyer. And now, don't want to do any self-promotion here, but basically, the short answer of that, Fiona's not into self-promotion. The short answer to that, when you get into trouble, like say there's a defamation claim or an infringement claim, or you violated any UAE laws, definitely probably should see a lawyer at that point. Or if anyone else has obviously infringed your podcast or anything you've created. But by then, possibly too late, either your podcast has been taken down and consumers don't usually give you a second chance, brutal world we're living in. So at the very least, you should make sure that you have very good written contracts, signing and or having broad licenses to the IP, or run it past a lawyer just to check that what the contents that you're talking about during your podcast is working with the UAE laws and content laws, just to make sure that it's okay, and getting it all signed up and good. All right, so like I said, please.
one of the things you need to keep in mind is if someone does write to you claiming that you've infringed their content or have, you know, stolen their idea, which is my favorite one because obviously it is almost meaningless, but nonetheless, the first thing you should do is just pause on that content, take it down or hide it or bury it so that it's not visible, to mitigate the damage while you get advice and work out what you're going to do first. What you don't want to do is, you know, leave a podcast up with a Kings of Leon song in it for another 3 months while you go and talk to lawyers and have a little argument about it, because that's another 3 months of infringing activity, and that's going to increase the license fee that you're going to have to pay if you are found to be infringing. So please be very aware that, you know, whilst we do see frivolous claims, and we do see quite a lot of them, it's always good to protect yourself first and go ahead and take down anything that might look problematic. Aisha, do you have a question? There she is. Would it be possible to email the session to our emails? We are recording. So I'm not quite sure where it's going to go afterwards, but we will send it through to everybody and make sure that you get access to whatever we've done today. We're also going to be creating a summary of today, which we'll be sending out as a client alert, and we'll send it first to each and every one of you. I'm sure it's going to look lovely once we finish it. We haven't finished it yet, but we are going to be doing that. And of course, we love to hear from you in any event, as Charlotte says. We love to chat to you, so if there's anything you need to know or anything that wasn't clear today, please let me know. Yeah. Izzy has asked 5 seconds of BBC from 1995. Considered fair use. I'm not going to answer the fair use question because I don't really think we have certainty on that in this market. But I think the risk of the BBC coming after you for a 1995 news clip for 5 seconds is quite low. Don't quote me on that, but I would have thought it's pretty low, although the BBC are quite litigious. So yeah, I would say, you know, and then if they write you a letter, take it down straight away. How's that? How's that for a really good answer? Yeah. Please do. So yeah, I hope that's us for today, guys. It's been lovely. We did 45 minutes. That's enough of us. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in our recording when we do it all again.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.
Bye.